So today, we're looking at the dumbest deaths recorded in human history. Number 10. Chrysippus of Soli. Our first story? A philosopher who laughed himself to death. Yes, you heard that right. Died from laughter. According to the ancient historian Josephus, the famous Greek philosopher Chrysippus of Soli died simply because he couldn't stop laughing. Who would have thought that a man so full of wisdom and logic would get taken out by something as simple as a laugh? Not exactly the sharpest exit for a philosopher, is it? Now, Chrysippus wasn't just any philosopher. This guy spent his life teaching people to control their emotions, saying real wisdom was about mastering your impulses. But all that wisdom couldn't save him from his own sense of humor. It all started one afternoon when Chrysippus was walking through his garden, when he saw a donkey munching on some figs. Pretty innocent scene, right? But for some reason, this completely cracked him up, and being the genius he was, Chrysippus decided to take it further. He ordered a servant to give the donkey some wine, to wash down the figs. Now, keep in mind, this guy spent his life teaching people how to stay calm and collected, and yet he thought getting a donkey tipsy was a brilliant idea. As the donkey started sipping the wine, Chrysippus just lost it. He laughed, and he kept laughing. And guess what? He didn't stop. He laughed so hard that he literally died. Yes, you heard that right. This great philosopher, who dedicated his life to teaching about self-control, choked on his own laughter. By the way, in case you're wondering how laughter can actually kill you, extreme laughter can trigger things like asphyxiation or cardiac arrest. Your body literally runs out of oxygen, and if it's not stopped in time, well, you can end up like Chrysippus. So yeah, maybe tone it down next time you're watching cat videos. Number 9. Hans Steininger, a 16th century mayor from Austria. Now, you'd think a mayor would be remembered for their leadership skills or maybe some groundbreaking policies. But no, Hans was famous for one thing and one thing only: his ridiculously long beard. And when I say long, I mean nearly 4 feet long. This beard wasn't just facial hair, it was practically a local celebrity. Fast forward to 1567, and everything in Hans's town is going just fine, until disaster strikes. The whole town catches fire, and as you can imagine, things get pretty chaotic. Hans, being the practical man he was, usually kept his massive beard tucked neatly into his jacket. I mean, safety first, right? Because when you're rocking a 4-foot beard, precautions are a must. But in the midst of the panic, with everyone running for their lives, Hans forgot the most important safety tip of all: tuck the beard. And that's where things went very, very wrong. As the fire raged on, Hans did what anyone would do. He ran. But with his beard trailing behind him like a fuzzy cape, disaster was inevitable. And then it happened. In a moment of pure tragic irony, Hans tripped. On what, you ask? Yep, you guessed it, his own beard. One wrong step and down he went, crashing to the ground in an epic slow-motion fall. Unfortunately, the fall was no joke. Hans broke his neck and died on the spot, all thanks to the very beard he'd spent years growing. In the end, Hans Steininger's beard, the symbol of his pride, became his downfall. His long beard made him stand out in history, but not quite in the way he'd hoped. Number 8. Aeschylus. In the golden age of ancient Greece, a time full of great thinkers, fearless warriors, and famous playwrights, there was Aeschylus, often called the father of tragedy. Aeschylus didn't just write plays. He transformed Greek theater from simple choral performances into complex multi-actor dramas. His tragedies, like Prometheus Bound and the Oresteia, dealt with big themes of fate, justice, and the gods. While his plays were full of drama, his own death was nothing short of, absurd. One day, while Aeschylus was going about his daily business, probably thinking about his next masterpiece, an eagle was flying overhead with its breakfast, a tortoise. Now, Aeschylus was known not just for his plays, but for his bald, shiny head, a perfect target in the eyes of an eagle. Spotting his shiny head, the bird thought, a perfect rock. Since eagles are clever problem solvers, they drop tortoises from high altitudes onto rocks to crack the hard shell and enjoy the soft flesh inside. You know where this is going, don't you? With sharp eyes and a hungry determination, the eagle positioned itself above Aeschylus's unsuspecting bald head and dropped the tortoise. Aeschylus, still deep in thought about his next play, didn't see it coming. Wham! The tortoise crashed down, killing him instantly. So, next time you're out in the open, keep an eye out for falling tortoises. You never know when they'll strike. Number 7. Sigurd the Mighty. It was the year 892 CE on the cold, windy plains of Scotland. Sigurd the Mighty was a towering Viking warlord, famous for his brutal conquests and legendary strength. This guy wasn't just a warrior, he was a force of nature, feared by anyone who dared to cross his path. But as mighty as he was in life, his death was as unexpected and absurd. After a tough battle, Sigurd had defeated his enemy, a local leader named Malbridget. But victory wasn't enough for Sigurd. He wanted to make a statement. So, in true Viking fashion, he took the severed head of his fallen enemy and tied it to his horse's saddle. Because, why not? Vikings were all about those grisly trophies. As Sigurd rode through the rugged highlands, the severed head bounced with each stride of the horse. But here's the twist. The severed head wasn't quite done with him yet. As the horse galloped, one of Malbridget's teeth scraped Sigurd's leg. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just a scratch from the skull of his dead enemy. But in those days, even a small wound could be deadly, thanks to infections that spread quickly without proper treatment. Now, here's where things get ironic. That tiny, barely noticeable scratch soon became infected. Before Sigurd knew it, the infection spread through his body, bringing down the mighty Viking warlord who had killed so many enemies. In a cruel twist of fate, Sigurd the Mighty, legendary warrior, was killed by a single tooth. In the end, Sigurd's greatest enemy wasn't a warrior or a weapon. It was a tooth. It's a grim reminder that no matter how strong or powerful you are, the smallest of things can sometimes bring you down. And sometimes, death has a strange sense of humor. Number 6. Tycho Brahe. In the 16th century, there was a Danish astronomer who basically rewrote the grand old constellations. Tycho Brahe. This guy was no ordinary man. He had a copper nose. Yes, you heard that right. A copper nose. Wondering what happened to his actual human nose? Well, let's just say he got it caught in a fight over a math argument and had it chopped off. But despite his odd appearance, Tycho became popular for his thorough observations and cool astronomical gadgets, and even earned the support of kings. His work laid the foundation for future discoveries, even influencing none other than Johannes Kepler. But for all his brilliance, Tycho's death was just as strange as his copper nose. It wasn't a miscalculation of the stars or a failed theory that killed him. It was his bladder. In 1601, Tycho went to a royal banquet. Back then, astronomers were like celebrities, and getting invited to dinner with royalty was a big deal. But during the meal, Tycho needed to use the bathroom. Here's the thing. In 16th century European courts, it was considered extremely rude to leave a banquet before the king. So Tycho, ever the noble guest, decided to hold it in. As the night went on, Tycho's discomfort grew, but he still wouldn't excuse himself. Hours passed, and eventually, his bladder just couldn't hold it anymore. The strain caused it to burst open like an overfilled balloon, leading to internal injuries. Tycho finally left the banquet, but it was too late. He suffered for 11 painful days before dying, as 16th century medicine couldn't save him from such an injury. In the end, Tycho Brahe, a man who spent his life studying the universe, was brought down by something as simple as holding his pee. It's cosmic irony, right? Even those who reach for the stars are still stuck with basic human problems. Number 5. Pythagoras. Next up is a man whose name might just bring back memories of high school math. Pythagoras. You know, the guy who came up with the Pythagorean theorem? The one who made geometry a bit more complicated? But besides being a mathematical genius, Pythagoras was also known for some, let's say, strange beliefs. One of his beliefs? He was totally convinced that beans were sacred. Yes, you heard that right. Pythagoras believed that beans, those little things we eat without a second thought, had deep spiritual meaning. Some say he thought beans contained souls. Others say they represented life and death. Either way, Pythagoras was serious about avoiding beans. Now, fast forward to his final moments. It wasn't a math problem that killed him. No, it was his bizarre bean belief. Pythagoras found himself in a sticky situation. He was being chased by enemies, most likely political or philosophical rivals, who had had enough of his teachings. Desperate to escape, he ran through the streets until he came upon a field. And what was in that field? You guessed it, beans. Pythagoras now faced a dilemma. He could run through the bean field to save himself, or stick to his belief that beans were sacred and untouchable. He was so devoted to his belief that he refused to run through the beans. Instead, he stopped right there at the edge of the field. His enemies quickly caught up with him. and without a single bean being touched. Pythagoras was beaten to death. In the end, the man who helped us understand the world through mathematics couldn't let go of a belief in the mystical power of beans. Number 4. Empedocles. Our next story is about a philosopher who tried to prove his immortality in the most dramatic way possible, by jumping into a live volcano. His name was Empedocles, a Greek philosopher, poet, and let's be honest, a bit of an oddball. See, Empedocles didn't just think he was a great thinker. He believed he was more than human. In fact, he thought he was a god. So, if you think you're a god, how do you prove it to everyone? Well, in Empedocles' case, you do something no normal person could survive. You jump into a volcano and demonstrate your immortality to the world. There he was, standing at the edge of Mount Etna, Sicily's fiery, active volcano, with a crowd gathered below waiting for something miraculous. Empedocles, full of confidence, jumped into the volcano, certain his godlike powers would protect him. But, as you might have guessed, things didn't go as planned. Instead of being lifted up into the heavens by the gods, Empedocles just died. His body was swallowed by the lava, and the only thing that came out was one of his bronze sandals, floating up from the pit as a final reminder that, nope, Empedocles wasn't a god. In the end, Empedocles' dramatic attempt to prove he was divine became a lesson in arrogance. He may have jumped into the volcano hoping to rise to the heavens, but all he left behind was a sandal, proof that even the boldest actions can end in a totally ordinary way. Number 3. Milo of Croton. The name Milo of Croton echoed through ancient Greece. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was a living legend, a man whose strength was unmatched, and whose victories in the Olympic Games made him a hero across the land. Milo won 6 Olympic titles in a row, and his feats of strength were so incredible that people thought he was almost superhuman. But despite his might, Milo's death was far from glorious. It was tragically ironic. One day, while walking through the woods, Milo came across a large tree with a split trunk, its massive form tempting him to show off his legendary strength. Instead of using an axe, Milo decided to split the tree with his bare hands. He stuck his hands into the crack, thinking he could rip the tree apart with sheer brute force. At first, it worked. The wood started to crack under Milo's immense power. But then, disaster struck. The tree snapped back suddenly, trapping his hands inside. Now, Milo, known for his ability to crush opponents with ease, was completely helpless, trapped by the very symbol of his strength. And if that wasn't bad enough, things got worse. With his hands trapped and no way to defend himself, a pack of wolves, sensing an easy meal, emerged from the forest. Milo, realizing the gravity of his situation, struggled desperately but couldn't free himself. Unable to escape, he could only watch as the wolves came closer. The man who had dominated the Olympic Games and been celebrated for his might met his end in the most ironic way, eaten by wolves while trapped by his own power. In the end, Milo's greatest asset, his legendary power, was also his downfall. He spent his life proving that nothing could stop him, but it was the very strength that defined him that led to his tragic and ironic death. Number 2. Qin Shi Huang. Imagine ruling over one of the greatest empires in history, holding immense power and believing you could live forever, only to be killed by the very thing you thought would grant you immortality. This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Known for uniting China and leaving behind the famous terracotta army, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with one thing above all: immortality. Qin Shi Huang wasn't just any emperor. After uniting China in 221 BCE, he became obsessed with the idea of living forever. He believed that since he had united the great Chinese Empire, he should live to see its greatness for all eternity. He surrounded himself with alchemists and scholars who promised him secret formulas to cheat death. His obsession with immortality grew so strong that he sent expeditions across the land to find mythical islands said to hold the elixirs of life. Eventually, his advisors recommended something they were sure would work: a substance called cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury. In ancient Chinese alchemy, mercury was believed to have life-extending properties, and who was going to argue with the emperor? If Qin Shi Huang believed it, then that's what he would consume. So he started taking mercury pills regularly, convinced that with each dose, he was one step closer to becoming a god. But there was just one small problem. Mercury is highly toxic. Over time, the emperor's health started to get worse. He experienced hallucinations, mood swings, and physical weakness, yet continued to take the mercury, not knowing it was slowly poisoning him. In 210 BCE, while on a tour of eastern China, Qinshu Wang suffered a severe collapse. His body, weakened from the mercury poisoning, couldn't take it any longer, and the emperor who once ruled an empire fell for the last time. The emperor who tried so desperately to escape death had sealed his fate with his own hand, poisoned by the very substance he believed would make him live forever. Number 1. Charles II of Navarre. Charles II of Navarre had earned a rather fitting nickname, Charles the Bad, and for good reason too. This guy wasn't exactly known for his kindness or honesty. His reign was marked by betrayals, cruelty, and countless acts of treachery. He stabbed so many people in the back, literally and metaphorically, that no one could have predicted just how bizarre and fitting his own death would be. By 1387, Charles was old, sick, and, no surprise, not very well liked. His enemies were countless, but in the end, it wasn't a rival or an assassination that got him. It was something far more ridiculous: his doctors. Back then, medicine wasn't exactly what we'd call advanced. In an attempt to treat his illness, Charles's doctors came up with a rather unusual remedy. They wrapped him in a cloth soaked in brandy, thinking it would somehow help him recover. That's right, brandy, the stuff we drink. They soaked the king in it and wrapped him up tightly, like a medieval cocktail. One night, while the servant was tightening the cloth around him, she accidentally brushed it against a candle. Boom! The brandy-soaked cloth instantly caught fire, and before anyone could do anything, Charles was engulfed in flames. In a matter of moments, Charles the Bad became Charles the Roasted. It's a horrifying way to die, no doubt. But with such a bizarre treatment, it's also one of the most absurd. A king who had survived countless betrayals and political was brought down not by an assassin's blade, but by his own doctor's brandy-soaked cloth and a servant's clumsy mistake.